Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. This is the Pamela and David B. Ford lecture, and we have a phenomenal speaker. But first, I want to, just in case David and Pamela are on the Zoom call, David is a member of our Board of Trustees. He and his wife, Pamela, have been long-term supporters of the organization. And on top of everything else, he has preserved a number of houses and farms, so he is a real preservationist. And so we thank him and Pamela very much for their wonderful support of this lecture and of the Preservation Society. And I know that David and Susan communicated earlier this week, so they have become friends. We are really excited to welcome back to Newport, because Dr. Schoelwer was here in 2015 for the Newport Symposium. But tonight she is going to be talking about the women who saved Mount Vernon, the early years. And what is most interesting about this story is that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union was truly the first preservation organization in the country. And I know that she is going to touch on why it was that that George Washington's homestead began to go into disrepair. That too is an interesting story, but it was an organization that got founded in 1850. Now about Dr. Schoelwer, she has done a number of lectures around the country on American art, decorative arts, needlework, women's history. She has a book out called Connecticut Needlework, Women, Art, and Family from 1740 to 1840. She has another book coming out soon on the collection of Mount Vernon. She has a PhD from Yale University. She has a master's from Winterthur in early American culture and a BA from the University of Notre Dame. She is a fascinating speaker because she was on the radio show with me a few days ago, and so I think you're all going to enjoy listening to her. I also want to draw your attention to 3 other upcoming events. Next Thursday, at 5:30, we will be welcoming Catherine Gilliland, who is with the John F. Kennedy Library, and she will be talking about Jacqueline Kennedy's White House Restoration Project. And then on July 28th, Tuesday, the Edo and Peter D. Kiernan Lecture will feature our fellow, Sebastian Dutton. Sebastian spoke several weeks ago. This time he is going to be talking about the amazing 3D work that he has done for the Preservation Society, all of our virtual tours. He is a wonderful speaker. He is going to be talking about exploring and sharing the 3rd floor of the Breakers, which is a space that most people have not yet seen. We hope they will in the future. And then finally, on August 5th, we have a phenomenal collaboration going with Hillwood. And Hillwood last night had a wonderful lecture. We are hosting Hillwood on the 5th at 6:30. The speaker will be talking about new discoveries about Hillwood's collection. The speaker is Rebecca Tillis. And if you're interested in listening to that lecture, this wonderful collaboration with our colleagues at Hillwood in Washington, D.C., you would go to their website, hillwoodestates.org. And if you want to RSVP to any of our lectures, you send an email to Bridget Gallagher. She is at program RSVP@newportmansions.org. And she will make sure that you receive all of the necessary information you need in order to join one of our lectures. So with that, Dr. Schoelwer, thank you so much for being with us tonight and for telling us the story of how preservation got started in America.
Great. Took a minute to unmute there. Thank you so much, Trudy, for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be with you all this evening, although admittedly, I wish I could be there in person, as I'm sure we all do. And thank you also to the Fords for their sponsorship of this lecture. When I received the invitation to present this lecture back in January, we were all living in quite a different world. The occasion, of course, is connected with next month, marking the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, guaranteeing women the right to vote. And so in observance of that anniversary, the focus of the Preservation Society's summer programming that I was invited to participate in was to be on women who have furthered the cause of historic preservation in this country. And that, as you've heard, is a theme central to Mount Vernon. So I was really delighted to have the excuse to do a deep dive into our institutional history in search of fresh perspectives. Of course, in the intervening months, indeed in the last few weeks, the cultural landscape in America has shifted dramatically as we battle not only a global pandemic, but also confront anew the legacy of slavery and racism and debate how we teach and memorialize American history. These are critical issues and the subject of ongoing and urgent discussions at Mount Vernon today, as we continue to evolve as a dynamic site of national memory, public history, preservation, research, and education. But tonight, as you've heard, I'm going to focus on the early years of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union. Okay, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So I think we have a little wrinkle here. I'm going to keep talking while you figure that out. So I'm focusing on the early years from 1850 until the 1890s. Here we go. Okay, share. All right, and now we need to do this. Voila, I think we have it. And I'm going to be paying particular emphasis to female leadership, to the uncharted character of historic preservation in that moment when the Mount Vernon Ladies Association got started, and how decisions taken then continue to provide a foundation for institutional change and growth, scholarship, and public engagement. Now, discussions of historic preservation in America regularly begin with the story of one woman, Anne Pamela Cunningham of South Carolina, and her unlikely but ultimately successful crusade in the 1850s to save, as a public trust, the home of the nation's first president. The organization that she created still owns and operates Mount Vernon as a private, nonprofit, charitable organization. Mount Vernon is not a national park, and we're not only not government owned, but we accept no government funding. So all that experience I got in previous jobs doing NEH grant proposals, worthless. Moreover, the MVLA remains today an all-female board, each member called a vice regent representing a different state. To date, there have been 284 vice regents representing 43 states plus the District of Columbia, and including 6 distinguished women who have represented Rhode Island on the Mount Vernon board. Individually and collectively, that's a roster of remarkable women, impossible to cover the full scope of their achievements in the time allowed. And so, as I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on the key challenges of the early years and how principles established then have remained foundational while allowing the MVLA, that's kind of our shorthand, the MVLA, to evolve and adapt over the subsequent century. So particularly how to organize, what to preserve, and how to furnish and interpret the mansion. So perhaps what people think of first in regard to a historic house museum. I also want to broaden our purview a bit to consider 4 women who were not vice regents, but whose roles were also critical to Mount Vernon's survival. Martha and Jane Washington on the left, mistresses of the house while it was still a family residence, and Sarah Tracy and Sarah Johnson, keepers as it became a public trust. Martha Dandridge Custis, of course, married George Washington in 1759 and oversaw Mount Vernon's domestic operations for 40 years. Her most significant role in its preservation came near the end of her life, as she conveyed particular household items to each of her 4 grandchildren. George Washington Parke Custis, the only male heir, received the largest legacy, including, quote, the bowl that has the ship in it, 2 girandoles and lustres, the china having M.W. on it. His sister Nellie received, quote, one of the new sideboard tables in the new room, 12 chairs with green bottoms, and much more. The care that Mrs. Washington, with which Mrs. Washington identified these goods, and the care that her descendants took in stewarding them are key factors in our ability to achieve the goal of presenting the mansion as it looked in 1799. Now, after Martha's death, the house and surrounding acreage remained in the Washington family for 3 generations. Jane Washington, seen in the portrait on the left with her children, actively managed the estate for almost a decade, from her husband's death in 1832 until their older son came of age. Her letters testify to the strain of trying to stretch Mount Vernon's declining income to cover increasing maintenance needs and the toll taken by rising numbers of visitors. Quote, I fear I shall hardly have funds sufficient to pay off the workmen, she wrote in 1838, quote, the dear old place will be more comfortable and decent in appearance than we have known it for many years, but it draws deep on a limited income to make it so. And so for me, Jane Washington is one of the unsung heroines of the Mount Vernon story, because she succeeded, really against all odds, in keeping the estate together. Without her, there might well have been no Mount Vernon to rescue in the 1850s. And that brings us to the oft-told story. In the fall of 1853, Louisa Dalton Bird Cunningham of South Carolina described the view from a steamboat on the Potomac River. Quote, it was a lovely moonlit night. I went on deck as we passed Mount Vernon. I was painfully distressed at the ruin and desolation of the home of Washington, and the thought passed through my mind. Why was it that the woman of his country did not try to keep it in repair if the men could not do it? It does seem such a blot on our country. Her daughter, Aunt Pamela, age 37, took up the charge, sending a letter to the Charleston newspaper, calling upon, quote, the mothers and daughters of the South to raise, quote, general contributions, each a mite, to purchase Mount Vernon, the, quote, shrine of true patriotism, and prevent its threatened destruction by, quote, manufacturers and manufactories, noise and smoke and deafening machinery. Now, it's really difficult for us today to appreciate, I think, just how quixotic Cunningham's quest was in 1853, and how unlikely its chances for success. She was entering uncharted waters in uncertain times, and I think we can identify 3 key challenges. The first is fundraising, not only getting the money, but what to do with it once you get it, how to receive, manage, and disperse the funds. Even spontaneous donations, as she termed them, need an organizational and legal structure, and there were virtually no models for a private philanthropic organization devoted to historic preservation. Second challenge, the original of this appeal was a woman, decades before women won the right to vote, and in fact had few legal rights and few respectable roles in public life. Prevailing norms held that a woman's place was in the home, her mental, physical, and emotional capacities supposedly unsuited to public leadership, and particularly to the management of money and property. Beyond this, Anne Pamela Cunningham was not only a woman, but an invalid, frequently in pain and sometimes immobilized due to a riding accident suffered as a teenager. Finally, and indeed looming over all the rest, was political crisis. The nation was literally being torn apart over slavery and its extension into Western territories. Now, Aunt Pamela's initial plan, as published in that first newspaper appeal, was both vague and unwieldy. What she had in mind was that these spontaneous contributions would be conveyed somehow to the governor of Virginia, who was to have, quote, authority and direction to purchase the Mount Vernon property, which would then be, quote, conveyed in trust to the President of the United States and the said governor of Virginia, to be preserved as a hallowed resort for all people. So structurally, what we have here is a pretty complicated interweaving of voluntary contributions on the one hand with political power, a specifically regional base in the South linked to the federal executive in a time of heated sectional crisis. What could possibly go wrong? However, her appeal struck a chord. In today's terms, it went viral. Newspapers around the country repeated her letter, reprinted her letter, necessitating that she quickly rethink both the scope and the organization of her campaign. And here we see this woman proving herself both a visionary and a canny tactician. By mid-1855, little more than a year after her original appeal, she had created a formal organizational structure, pretty much out of whole cloth, pointedly naming it the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union. She thus broadened her cause to a national campaign. She removed it from the political sphere, making a virtue of female association. Specifically because women were apolitical, they were inherently better suited to being the, quote, purest guardians of a national shrine. And she styled herself the regent, signaling her vision of the organization as stewards of this national trust. In each state, she named a vice regent, who in turn recruited lady managers heading up local fundraising committees. And these were responsible for raising funds in whatever manner best suited their particular connections and communities. So, for example, by 1858, New York State had a committee of 31 lady managers headed by none other than Mary Morris Hamilton, two distinguished names, granddaughter of Alexander Hamilton and great-granddaughter of Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution. And there were a variety of different fundraising strategies. Donations of $1 received as a premium a gilt-framed lithograph of Gilbert Stuart's Athenaeum portrait of George Washington, an example of which we recently acquired for the collection, and you see on the left. The most substantial fundraiser in this campaign was Edward Everett, former president of Harvard University, former governor of Massachusetts, and the unfortunate orator who was scheduled to follow Lincoln at the Gettysburg Memorial Service. His lectures on George Washington's character raised almost $70,000, a little over $2 million today. By 1858, Miss Cunningham had located 22 vice regents representing states from Florida, north to Maine, and westward as far as Wisconsin, Iowa, and Missouri. 3 examples from this first group suggest her talent for recruiting lieutenants possessed of intelligence, enterprise, influence, and wherewithal. From Virginia, there was Anna Ritchie, an internationally acclaimed actress, playwright, and novelist. But for Miss Cunningham, Mrs. Ritchie's most useful connections were political. Her husband was the Richmond newspaper publisher, and their connections aided in securing from the Virginia Assembly the legal status necessary for the MVLA to own real estate in its own right. From Florida, she recruited Catherine Gray, who combined family and glittering social connections. Not only was she a third cousin to John Augustine Washington, the last owner of Mount Vernon, but her grandfather had captained George Washington's lifeguard during the Revolution. She was described as a, quote, great patriot, despite possessing a royal title. I think the only royal title on the MVLA board, thanks to her marriage to one of Napoleon's nephews. Not surprising, she was noted for fundraising through balls and similar social events. From Massachusetts, there was Louisa Greenough, heiress to several old Boston merchant families. Her connections were in the realm of arts and letters, as she was the widow of the prominent neoclassical sculptor Horatio Greenough, with whom she lived in Newport in 1851. Louisa spent virtually all of her 7-year tenure as a vice-regent traveling abroad, but she was nonetheless an indefatigable writer of letters in support of the cause. And she offered for sale as a fundraiser framed engravings of her husband's monumental statue of George Washington. In February 1858, the association signed an agreement for an expansive purchase. 200 acres, including the tomb of Washington, the mansion, garden, and grounds, for the sum of $200,000, about $5.7 million today. Now, understandably, Miss Cunningham's crusade to save Mount Vernon had focused attention on the mansion's deteriorating conditions, and repairs had, as seen here, were underway even before the association officially took possession on Washington's birthday in 1860. Nonetheless, one of the things I am repeatedly struck by is the remarkable integrity of the structure. Whether because of financial constraints or a growing consciousness of the historic significance of the property, the 19th century Washingtons made few, if any, major alterations. To be sure, they repainted and papered inside, and they used rooms in different ways. But they had not added on wings, torn out partition walls, added kitchens or bathrooms, or any of the other kinds of major changes that would have destroyed original fabric and been very difficult for preservationists to undo. However, their timing was bad. Before much could be done, war intervened, and the imminent challenge became how to survive a civil war, with the front lines effectively in Mount Vernon's backyard. In May 1861, Mount Vernon seceded from the Union, and federal troops immediately occupied the city of Alexandria, seen here in the background, less than 10 miles north of Mount Vernon, and much of the intervening territory, as we see on this map. Connecticut pickets, on the other hand, were near Pohick Church, about 6 miles away, just on the other side of Accotink Village on the left of your screen. Miss Cunningham went back to South Carolina, but in the spring of 1861, she dispatched her secretary, Sarah Cornelia Tracy, to take up residence in the mansion, judging that, quote, the presence of a lady would be Mount Vernon's, quote, greatest protection, ensuring respect toward the place from both contending parties. Also in residence in the mansion was a female assistant secretary and chaperone, Mary McMakin, and a male superintendent, Upton Herbert, who was a local gentleman and distant relative and longtime friend of the Washington family. They were also supported by a staff of freed African Americans, some of them formerly enslaved at Mount Vernon, now engaged as paid employees. Emily the cook, Priscilla and Frances housemaids, George the coachman, gardeners and farmers. Dandridge Smith and Thomas King were sent to the market in Alexandria to sell produce and purchase provisions when military passes could be obtained. This was a difficult time. There was little cash, few supplies, and much isolation. Visitation, the primary source of revenue, plummeted, and for long stretches, the only visitors were federal soldiers, many of whom professed themselves unable to pay the 25-cent admission fee. Mount Vernon's residents, both white and black, survived largely off the produce of its gardens and fields, supplemented by hunting and fishing, income from sales of fruits and vegetables, hay and corn, Also, walking sticks, surplus bricks made on the estate, cut flower bouquets, bracelets made of coffee beans, and beginning in 1865, souvenir photographs. Now, Miss Tracy proved herself an, quote, uncommon woman, combining education, gentility, and what we might call spunk. She was a native of Troy, New York, where her father was a mill owner and prosperous businessman, and she had been educated at Emma Willard's pioneering Troy Female Academy. Upton Herbert, being a Virginia, was unable to travel through federal territory, so the conduct of any official business off the estate necessarily fell to Sarah. When passes could not be obtained for Dandridge or Thomas to do the marketing, Sarah resolved to herself be the, quote, market woman, passing through the picket lines in a mule cart driven by Robert, one of the African-American gardeners, whom she called a, quote, sober, faithful, and reliable man. She also traveled to Washington to meet with Union commanders and even President Lincoln to successfully plead for passes and guarantees of neutrality for Mount Vernon. And there is a happy ending. 5 years after resigning her position in 1867, Sarah married Upton Herbert, and they did seem to live happily ever after. Miss Cunningham returned to Mount Vernon in December 1866, and the association was then effectively starting over. And there were many questions facing them as they entered this second phase, moving from fundraising to actual preservation. And the biggest question, I think, really was what to preserve. Here, we truly come to appreciate Miss Cunningham as strategic visionary. Consider, for example, the advice not taken. One of the suggestions was to fit out the grounds as a memorial sculpture park. Another was to preserve the mansion by disassembling it, constructing a replica of more durable brick, stone, and iron, and then applying, quote, all the old interior parts to create a veneer of authenticity. A third was to conserve scarce funds by preserving only the mansion and family tombs, the other structures being only work areas, being of no interest. And Pamela Cunningham's vision, in contrast, was spatially inclusive and chronologically specific. From the beginning, she embraced far-sighted goals to restore the house, the outbuildings, the gardens, and the grounds as nearly as possible to the condition in which they were left by George Washington. This vision, that visitors should see Mount Vernon as Washington did, remains at the core of Mount Vernon's identity. Enshrined in Miss Cunningham's farewell address of 1875 and printed each year in our annual report, quote, the mansion and the grounds around it should be religiously guarded from changes, should be kept as Washington left them. Those who go to the home in which he lived and died wish to see in what he lived and died. So as a result of her holistic vision for preservation, today's visitors encounter not only an elite residence, but an unsurpassed array of the original work buildings that once supported it. A smokehouse, spinning room, washhouse, stable, and 11 others. These structures provide both a physical and a human context for the Washingtons and the Mansion House, an expanded story of Mount Vernon as a working plantation inhabited and operated by a complex community that in 1799 numbered 317 enslaved men, women, and children, individuals whose stories are increasingly a focus of research and interpretation. Now, the vision, I think, could hardly have been more clearly conceived, but the devil was in the details. How did one, in fact, know what Mount Vernon had looked like in Washington's day? Miss Cunningham's emphasis on preventing change, stopping the hand of progress, implicitly presumed that the structures, gardens, and grounds were essentially as they had been 6 decades earlier. And to a rather surprising degree, they were. The major elements of Washington's landscape plan, shown on the right in 1787, had survived largely intact, retaining his paths, walls, and even many of the individual trees he had planted. Even more surprising were the neat rows of outbuildings he had built, the working core of his plantation. Of course, there had been some changes, most notably the construction of Washington's new tomb in the 1830s. Other features had become so much a part of Mount Vernon's identity that they were assumed to have always been there, incorporated into imagined scenes of 18th century bonhomie. How was one to know that the pavilion at the southeast corner of the lawn, seen here on the right of this painting, or the two-story porch on the south end of the mansion, or the balustrade atop the piazza, had all been added by George's nephew? The study of American architectural history had not yet even been imagined, so there were no tools for sorting out later additions from surviving 18th century features. The ladies also faced a more elemental challenge: how to survive financially. The campaign to raise purchasing funds, followed by immediate repairs, followed by 4 years of war, had exhausted public interest in further donations. So the property needed to be self-sustaining, as it hardly had been since George Washington's day. And so, despite her avowed commitment to preserving Mount Vernon, and as it had been in Washington's time, Miss Cunningham's attitude toward the grounds and service buildings was necessarily pragmatic, with preservation achieved in part through continued use. The fields and orchards continued to be cultivated. We see here the haystacks literally right up to the doorstep of the piazza. In 1873, there were corn, oats, rye, potatoes, peaches, all kinds of fruit trees, 200 young grape plantings, 4,000 cabbage plants, plus cows, mules, hogs, 100 turkeys, and 500 chickens. The mansion kitchen was reconfigured to serve as a lunchroom for employees and tourists, and the adjacent well house, which you see here, was used for selling Mount Vernon milk and other dairy products. Photographs and guidebooks and other outbuildings were adapted for use for lodgings for employees and the vice-regents when they were on site. The profitability of flower sales called for a greenhouse, but George Washington's had burned. Lacking evidence on his appearance, the ladies in 1869 built a new production greenhouse, later supplemented by a grapery, carnation house, rose house, palm house, and modern propagating house, all added to support commercial sales. Continuity of function in the gardens evidently sufficed to anchor visitors' perceptions that they were indeed following in Washington's footsteps. That sense of mythic continuity was fostered by successive generations of free African Americans who made up the bulk of the Mount Vernon workforce into the 1890s. There was Jim Mitchell, the old gardener, who also sold flowers and souvenir walking sticks. There was Edmund Parker, who stood guard at the tomb in the 1880s and 1890s, often telling stories of olden days, even though he had not been born until nearly 3 decades after George Washington died. Then there was Sarah Parker Johnson, who is, for me, like Jane Washington, another of the unsung heroines of the Mount Vernon story. While the vice-regents came and went, attending annual council meetings and occasional on-site visits, Sarah was a constant presence, presiding over day-to-day operations in the mansion for 27 transformative years. She had actually been born at Mount Vernon, one of the enslaved owned by John Augustine Washington, and she came back as an employee in 1865 to tend the poultry and the dairying, to cook and do the washing. With her husband Nathan, who was the Mount Vernon butler, she lived in the reconfigured 18th century storehouse just across the south lane from the kitchen. From 1872 to 1873, she and Nathan operated the lunchroom, serving visitors and staff out of the kitchen, the profits supporting estate operations. And after Nathan died in 1885, Sarah succeeded to his position in charge of the mansion. It was she, as keeper, who provided the new superintendent, Colonel Dodge, with information on each mansion furnishing as he took inventory on his first inspection tour. Among the things that Sarah would have shown him were the 15 original items that had come with the mansion from John Augustine Washington, including the globe and spyglass from Washington's study, a fragile fan coral he had collected on his one trip to the Caribbean, the key to the Bastille prison sent by the Marquis de Lafayette, the clay bust by French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon. More relics than furnishings, these precious items did little to fill the mansion's 19 rooms, not counting closets, prompting complaints from visitors about the, quote, desolate and forlorn appearance. The association's work on the interiors began with a search for physical evidence. Imagine Miss Cunningham in her long sleeves and full skirts, scraping off paint and peeling wallpaper, on the hunt for early colors and patterns. The result is an archive of more than 70 wallpaper fragments, ranging in date from Washington's earliest order in 1757 into the 19th century. Today, these fragments are the focus of renewed study, including things like pigment analysis, multispectral imaging, and other applications of modern technology that would not be possible without early attention to this kind of architectural forensics. When it came to furnishings, the highest priority then as now was to locate and bring home items originally owned by the Washingtons. This would be a long, slow process, though, and what the association needed was a strategy to quickly achieve a cheerful, quote, old home appearance to welcome and encourage visitors. It was Nancy Halsted of New Jersey who in 1868 proposed the mansion's first furnishing plan. Vice regents from the original 13 states would take the lead, each adopting and furnishing a specific room. How this was accomplished was essentially left to each individual vice regent, just as the choice of fundraising methods had been in the previous decade. Not surprisingly, the result was something of a competition among the states, a rather piecemeal approach and much debate, with a key conundrum being the tension between relics and furnishings. Should the mansion be a museum or a residence? Authentic or homey? Was it about Washington or the nation? Could it be all of the above? In 1878, the vice regent for Illinois took charge of the front parlor, the responsibility for room furnishings having by then been expanded beyond the original 13 states. Mrs. Berry's fundraising appeal sets forth a clear set of principles, even as it reveals how novel preservation remained 25 years after the association's founding. To bring back, quote, the old home look, she explained, quote, it is our intention to adhere scrupulously to the original, so far as it is possible to ascertain what that was. We shall not feel at liberty to indulge our personal fancies, but shall consult historical facts. The first case should be to restore every room to its original condition, and then the furniture can be provided as we can learn what was originally used. If any of the original furniture, pictures, or other appointments can be obtained, they will. Otherwise, facsimiles will be produced or appropriate furniture designed and made. As with the preservation of the structures, the devil was in the details. How was one to ascertain the original appearance and identify original or appropriate furniture? Nancy Halsted urged adherence to Washington's probate inventory, which had been published as early as 1860. But still, many questions remained. For Mrs. Berry's front parlor, the inventory lists 1 elegant looking glass, 1 tea table, 1 sofa, 11 mahogany chairs. It offers no information about size, style, color, ornamentation. When such evidence was not available, the ladies concluded logically enough, that they could legitimately rely on their best judgment about what George Washington likely would have selected. As Miss Cunningham opined in 1869, quote, "We pledge to keep things as Washington left them, where it is a possibility, but where it is not known, surely we can choose what would make the best appearance." And given that there was virtually no study of American decorative arts in the 1870s, anything older than grandmother's was old enough to convey an appropriate old home look. Thus we find in the Illinois room, straight ahead to the left of the fireplace, one of George Washington's Louis XVI chairs purchased from the French minister for the president's house, juxtaposed with a 19th century Empire sofa on the right. Across the hall in the South Carolina room, also known as the dining room, the widow of the state's Confederate governor created more of a museum room with portraits of the state's Revolutionary War generals and a large display case in the far corner, one of several installed in the mansion. While such museum fittings diverged from the ideal of the home Washington knew, they served to enshrine another kind of authenticity. Patriotic relics and historical curiosities, ranging from Washington autographs and bits of his coffin to a piece of the Old North Bridge in Concord, Massachusetts, and hair from the tail of Zachary Taylor's horse, offered tangible connections to a national past. Now, Alice Mary Longfellow of Massachusetts had a deep personal connection to Washington's legacy. The daughter of poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, she lived her entire life in the house that had served as Washington's Cambridge headquarters in 75-76. Built in 1759, the Longfellow House displays many features similar to those installed by George Washington when he expanded Mount Vernon at the same time. A comparison of the parlors and the central passage in both houses. As a girl, Miss Longfellow had often visited her father in his study, which still contains the furnishings left at his death in 1883. A century earlier, it had served as George Washington's war room, the site of countless meetings with generals and statesmen. One can only imagine the meaning it must have had for Miss Longfellow to take charge of furnishing Washington's study at Mount Vernon. Over the course of her 50-year tenure, she succeeded in bringing home two key Washington pieces. On the left, his imposing secretary bookcase and the distinctive rotating barrel armchair that he called his uncommon chair, seen in front of the secretary on the left. And she carefully arranged the room to echo the sanctuary she had known from childhood. And so we arrive at the cusp of the 20th century. Time does not permit further exploration of the women who saved Mount Vernon, except for a brief sketch of the contributions of Rhode Island's 6 vice-regents. The first was Abby Chase on the left, a member of the Brown faculty community and a very successful fundraiser. One of the most longest serving of Anne Pamela Cunningham's initial recruits, she provided continuity from the original fundraising campaign through the first 3 decades of preservation and furnishing. She was succeeded by Ann Ames and then by Anne Brown, and in 1936 by Hope Powell Harkness, who became regent, that is chairman of the board, from 1948 to 1958. Mrs. Harkness's tenure saw some important firsts: the visitation for the first time exceeding 1 million people in the year, the celebration of the association's centennial, and the beginnings of efforts to reconstruct lost original buildings, beginning with George Washington's greenhouse and slave quarters, based on archaeological and documentary evidence, and using 18th century bricks salvaged from the reconstruction of the White House. Mrs. Harkness was succeeded by her daughter, Hope Powell Alexander, a longtime supporter of the Preservation Society as well. And today's Vice Regent from Rhode Island, Liz Rollins Moran, who is chairman of our Preservation Committee and thus one of my bosses and a generous supporter of many initiatives. So just to leave you with, I hope, a tantalizing taste of what's new at Mount Vernon. We continue to do all the things that preservationists do, preserving the architecture. We just completed a restoration of the West Front in 2019, continuing with redoing the rooms based on the latest documentary and forensic research, and a furnishing plan for the whole house, looking at the hierarchical arrangements of rooms typical of the 18th century. So the New York room that you saw earlier, the new room today as of 2014, Mrs. Halsted's New Jersey room, now the blue room, Mrs. Barry's Illinois room, now the front parlor, restored just last year. We also, a culminating achievement of many years planning in 2013, opened a fabulous research library, which not only has collections of books and manuscripts and digital collections, but is a vibrant center of research with fellowships, teacher education, and leadership programs, and public programs highlighted by our annual Mount Vernon Symposia, which rotates between topics of the decorative arts, the gardens, and art and architecture. We also have a lively exhibition program, which right now is focused on our special exhibition, Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon. And it's been a real a launching pad for expanding our interpretation on the estate, interpreting the lives of that enslaved community at Mount Vernon and memorializing their remains at the slave cemetery. And I haven't even spoken about the gardens, but we have fabulous gardens. The upper garden was restored in 2011 back to Washington's original plan, which was recovered archaeologically. And so Mount Vernon is today more than a historic house museum. Building on the foundation of the early years of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, it is a vibrant center for public history, research, education, critical thinking, and yes, inspiration. Building on those foundations forged in the shadow of America's most divisive conflict by a group of pioneering female preservationists committed to nation building. And I do want to close by saying that we are open again. Yesterday, the mansion opened to the public after our first closure period, and we hope that you will join us either in person or virtually on any one of different platforms available. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful, wonderful talk, Dr. Schoelwer. Thank you so much. And what an inspiring story. And I do want you to know that Liz Moran is on this Zoom lecture tonight. So hello, Liz, and thank you for joining us. And I also want you to know that Jim Donahue, who is the acting director of our Department of Museum Affairs, says that, and is a horticulturist, says your book on gardens, George Washington's Gardens, which I did not mention in the introduction, is a phenomenal book. So if you're interested in gardens, buy Dr. Schoelwer's book. I'm hoping that people will have questions, and you should direct them to me if you want, with your chat icon up in the right, or on my machine it's on the right. But there have to be some questions. There's never been a lecture without questions. Okay, I'm gonna just take a minute.
Trudy, can I ask one? I unmuted myself.
Yes, go ahead, Jim. And
This is Jim Donahue. Susan, could you say a little bit about how the garden restoration took place and the archaeology used to recreate the upper garden?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The inspiration for starting the garden restoration was actually rather sad that our boxwood died, as much of the boxwood up and down the East Coast did. And so the boxwood had grown to be about 6 feet high or so, and really crowded in on all the paths. But when it had to be removed, that provided the moment that our archaeologists had long been waiting for, which was a chance to go in and dig in the upper garden. And they ultimately, they did a very careful dig in selected areas of the garden. They actually found 7 layers of gardens that from the various generations that had lived there going back to the 1760s. And so they were able to identify the layer that matched with Washington's vision. He came back from the Revolution in 1785 and redid the garden. And they found evidence of gravel paths, wide gravel paths that exactly corresponded to the location of paths in that 1787 plan of Mount Vernon that I showed you. And so we have in the archaeology storage, we have squares of 1787 gravel that has been preserved from that dig. And so it was a really, really exciting project to get that information. Also really scary because they came in with bulldozers and really scraped off all the intervening layers of the most recent garden, which was a beautiful garden, but very sort of Victorianized with all kinds of complicated little paths and floral designs, which hadn't been there in Washington's time. So it was scary to see those bulldozers come in. But we really feel that it looks convincingly like an 18th century garden now.
Excellent question. Thank you, Jim. There are a number of questions. So the first that I will ask is, what was the relationship of Jane to George?
Jane's husband, John Augustine Washington III, was George's great-great-grandnephew. So George and Martha Washington didn't have any children of their own. The property went to his nephew, Bushrod Washington. Bushrod did not have any children, so it went to his nephew, John Augustine Washington II, and then to his, well, then to Jane, and then to their son, John Augustine III.
Aha, that's a complicated one.
It is, and they all have the same names, which makes it harder.
Right. One of the questions that is asked is, you mentioned the library. How much of George Washington's library manuscripts, letters are housed actually in the library, and how many items are there in total?
Great questions. George Washington's library at the time of his death had something like 1,100 titles in it. We have a little over 100, I think it's about 108 of his original volumes, the ones that he actually owned. We are building a library of duplicate editions of the ones that he owned so that we can replicate the contents of his library. And then I don't know the exact number of Washington manuscripts, but we also have Martha Washington manuscripts, Washington family manuscripts, so we can trace what happens to the property in the 19th century. We have the archives of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and so we are gradually building the collection. George Washington's library itself and his manuscripts, again, went to Bushrod and then to different nephews. The largest collection is at the Boston Athenaeum. And much of the papers have been spread out all over the place. So there might be a letter here and a letter there, but we are also work with the University of Virginia on the George Washington Papers Project, which numbers something over 70 volumes and is available online. So it's a very challenging thing to create a research library when all of the original materials are spread around. And so that is what makes the fellowship program so important, that we bring scholars together who can talk to each other and really encourage research and thinking.
I think that Liz Moran will like these combined questions. One is, how can I support the Ladies Association, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association? So you did a good job selling today. And then the second question is, how do you become a ladies as part of the association? Are you voted in? Are you nominated? What is the process?
Well, two good questions. Well, as far as supporting us, there are many ways you can support us. We welcome donations. You can find your way to that on our website. We also have an active membership program. And particularly in the wake of this spring's closure, we're doing a lot of exciting programming online, some of it available only to members. So we would be grateful for any and all donations. How one becomes a member of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, I mean, that is our board of directors. It remains as it was in Aunt Pamela's day, that there can be no more than one vice regent representing each state, and how the vice regents are located, named, recruited, appointed is known only to the vice regents.
Aha, a mystery. Sounds very intriguing. One of the questions is, are the flowers in the renovated garden native wild flowers, or do they follow a prescription of Washington's travels, and were they referred to in his diaries or anything else?
Well, that's another great question, and I would refer you to our book, The General in the Garden. There are lists of the plants that Washington acquired. He did make a concerted effort to acquire plants from all over what became the United States. So he was writing to contacts in New York for pines. He was writing to South Carolina for magnolias. So we do plant plants that we know that Washington had. And there are still about a little over a dozen now, I believe, trees that we know date back to Washington's time, including 2 lovely tulip poplars on the Bowling Green.
One of the questions here is, have the documents that you have been digitized, and is there accessibility by us, the public, to those documents? And then a second question, which is not related at all, but I'll ask it while I'm here, is you must be on pursuit always for finding objects that are out there that you want to have come back, of course, to Mount Vernon. How is that process carried out, if you can explain it at all? Do you find things by happenstance? Is it some wonderful person living in Kansas says, I think I have an original, come and see it? What is the process of finding new items?
Well, 2 great questions. Yes, we are in the process of digitizing the materials in the library collections, and they are, you can check on our website, www.mountvernon.org, get to the library page, go to research, scroll down to digital collections, and you can see what we have. As to how we find original Washington items, the answer is all of the above. And funny that you should mention Kansas, because there was an original Martha Washington letter found in a small historical society in Kansas a few years ago that we were contacted about. It's still in Kansas. But we've been at this for some 160 years now, and we have files which are called Washingtoniana Unowned, which I thought was the strangest title that I'd ever heard of when I got here. But it's very useful because we have some pieces that have been brought to our attention, you know, generations ago, and people may contact us to say, I have this table or I have this chair, and I can go and look it up. And I probably know more about it than the person does, because we've been keeping an eye on these things for literally generations. So it is rare that something turns up that we haven't heard about, but it does happen. There was one of the Martha Washington State's china dishes that came up for sale at an auction in Boston a few years ago that we knew of the service. We didn't know of that plate. Our vice regent from Massachusetts, Andrea Sahin, went and looked at it for us, and we were able to purchase that and bring it home. So, but sometimes things turn up. We keep in touch. Many things are still owned by Martha Washington descendants, and we keep in touch with them. So it's an exciting process.
Here's a very good question. So many English country houses in the colonies look alike, but not Mount Vernon. How was the house designed and built, and are there any other buildings that resemble Mount Vernon? I certainly don't know of any. This comes, by the way, from a person who is a very good historian.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, we tend now to think of Mount Vernon as being sort of a quintessential Southern Virginia plantation house. But that's mostly because of all the replicas that have been built looking like Mount Vernon afterwards. If you look around at what was being built in Virginia in the 1730s, when it was first built by Washington's father, and then how Washington expands it with the 2-story high pilasters, with the cupola, with the Venetian window on the north end. It's really unusual in the Virginia context. There are a few bits and pieces that one can point to. You know, perhaps the pilasters were something that Washington saw when he went on his one trip to the Caribbean. The cupola is certainly something like what you see on public buildings. The Venetian window is coming out of a pattern book, but really overscaled. The rusticated wooden siding boards you, of course, see on the Redwood Library in Newport, and we know Washington visited there in the 1750s. There does not seem to have been an architect. We have one of Washington's drawings in the 1770s shows his idea for the west facade and shows the floor plan he envisioned. So he seems to have been his own architect, pulling pieces together from things that he liked. And then, of course, the builders, the actual guys who are building the structure, they seem to have had pattern books or pages of pattern books, because there are specific elements that are quoted very directly from pattern books, but not the whole. You're right. It's quite distinctive in its time.
Mm-hmm. Would you be able to talk at all about the efforts that Mount Vernon is taking now to include African-American participation on the staff? I'm sure that all museums are now talking about this and actively, and we'll hear from you.
Right. Well, we are. We have a new position that we created last year, which is really to focus on the African-American perspective in our interpretation, in our programming, and also in our hiring. We have many people across the estate working in different roles, generally behind the scenes. We do have an African-American man who is now one of our costume interpreters, playing the role of Christopher Shields, Washington's valet, and William Lee, I think, his other valet. It's not necessarily an easy position to fill. To portray those roles, from what I understand. But it is something that we are certainly consciously looking at, and today redoubling our efforts in that area. It's an area that, Mount Vernon, the Ladies Association, has taken steps toward over the years on the interpretive side. The first memorial to the African Americans buried at Mount Vernon was put up in the 1920s, and then a new memorial installed in the 1980s, designed by Howard University architects. The greenhouse slave quarters has been interpreted for decades now, and we really revisited that in 2011, just after I got here, with new evidence, when we did the Lives Bound Together exhibit, which really, one of the distinctive features of looking at slavery at Mount Vernon is we have so much original documentation. that we can look at the lives of individuals, which is very rare for enslaved people in the 18th century. And we created a database that is available on our website, and you can look at that that material through our website. So I think, you know, we've really been doing a lot on the interpretive angle.
Great. So there are lots more questions, but we are running to our end. I'm going to give you a real softball. Who is buried at Mount Vernon? How many years did Washington live there? How many children did he and Martha raise? And for those of you who asked about the lectures in the future, I announced 4, so it would take too much time. Please go to our website and look for upcoming lectures. There's one next Thursday that features Jackie Kennedy's White House, and I hope you all will come back. So again, who is buried at Mount Vernon? How many years did Washington live there? How many children did he and Martha raise?
Okay, so Washington lived at Mount Vernon for about 2 years when he was 2 to 4 years old. And then he lived here from the mid-1754 until 1799. So I think that gives us something like 47 years total. Of course, he was gone for 8 years during the Revolution, and he was gone for most of 8 years during the presidency. So do all that adding and subtracting and what you come up with. George and Martha Washington raised her 2 children, Jack and Patsy, and then they raised 2 of Jack's 4 children. They raised granddaughter Nellie and grandson George Washington Parke Custis. And in between, there were always lots of nieces and nephews, many of them orphaned, who were sort of cycling through. So there were always lots of children around Mount Vernon, even though George and Martha Washington did not have any of their own. Now, who's buried at Mount Vernon? George and Martha Washington, as well as I think about 24 family members are also buried with them in the new tomb. Family members who died between the 1750s, when the old tomb was first created, probably in the time of Washington's older half-brother Lawrence, up to Jane Charlotte Blackburn Washington. She was the last Washington buried at Mount Vernon in 1855. And then there are dozens buried in the African American Cemetery. We've been doing survey work there, and we've so far located, I think, about 80 some grave sites. There may be as many as 150 there, and that's an ongoing project.
Wow, that is a wonderful lecture. We are so privileged to have had the opportunity to hear from you, Dr. Schoelwer, and we thank you very much for your time and your attention. It was a great speech. And everybody, if you haven't been to Mount Vernon, you could go hundreds of times. There's always something new to learn. So put it on your bucket list when we can travel again. And thank you all very much for being with us tonight, and we hope to see you next Thursday.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be with you.